everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny and I'm here today to do a book review of Foxfire, Confessions of a Girl Gang by Joyce Carol Oates. This novel really surprised me, and I think I had full disclosure, I had a preconceived notion of what this novel would be about because I had watched a film of the same name from 1996, and it was loosely based on this novel, but the plot is set in a different time period, and other than the character names and some of the situations, it was actually a very different novel from the film that I watched. There has subsequently been a new film made, which I may watch in the future, that is set in the same time period that this one is. So this is set in the 1950s in New York State, in a working class neighborhood. So this book is written in a confessional diary style. I found for the first couple chapters that was a little bit off-putting to me. I had a hard time connecting with the narrative voice, which is our character Maddie. Maddie is one of 5 girls between the ages of 14 and 17 who become a part of a gang. And it's important to understand that this is women living in a very specific time period, in a very specific social economic class. And they have very few options available to them for ways to fight back against sexism, against abuse, against poverty, and against a lot of people who are trying to take advantage of them because they are women. And so when they see gang culture around them, male gangs, they feel empowered by the idea of creating one themselves. And this is all led by Legs, whose real name is Margaret, but her nickname is Legs. And Legs is really one of the main characters. She is the protagonist. She is the villain. She's kind of everything rolled into one. She's a very complex character. And I would say that about all the characters in this novel. They're all very complex. They all have multiple layers. None of them are perfect. None of them are terrible, completely terrible. I guess the people that prey on these girls and these young women would be able to be considered terrible. One of the ideas in this novel is the idea of power and power through violence, and how that does make things black and white. And that is one of the downfalls of the gang, is that everything becomes so black and white for some of the gang members, and some of them continue to see things in a bit more of a grayscale and think, wait a minute, what are we doing? What are we saying? How are we empowering ourselves by perpetuating this violence, by, wreaking this violence onto others? And there's a lot of abuse in this novel, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect from parental figures who are not taking care of their children, are not involved in their children's lives. And I think that an underlying theme of the novel is the idea of this level of poverty, and the fact that being in this level of poverty creates scenarios in which people are not empowered. I'll also say there is language in this book that would be offensive to some people, and I think the language choices may not have been made by Joyce Carol Oates today, if she was writing this novel today, because of the way perceptions have changed around this type of language and accessibility. But unfortunately, in the mid-90s, when she wrote this, she did use this language. And I have no doubt that these types of characters, these are white people living in a working class neighborhood, would use derogatory racist words against other people. Like, I have no doubt that would have been the case. And she did use those words in here, particularly the N-word, which I would just caution anyone reading this that it is in here. If that is a triggering thing for you, then I would proceed with caution with the language. But I do think that the use of the language makes a point about the situation, about these women, about their working class background, their lack of power, and the things that they'll grasp at to get any power they can. And so in this case, if you look into history, white people who are underprivileged would use racism as a way to have a little bit more power than racialized people and minorities. And so that is a huge issue, and it is talked about in this book because in the 1950s, of course, that would have been more prevalent than today, although, of course, it still happens today. So this concept of violence as power is very strong in this book. The women are a gang, and so they have power in numbers, and their connection to each other, their bond with each other, allows them to strike back physically against a lot of the men who are abusing them, who are preying on them, who are trying to take advantage of them. And that is another very strong theme in here. And I think that it's very interesting to see this type of violence portrayed through women characters, because it's very often not only portrayed through male characters. So I think that was another really interesting and important thing that this book exposes and that shows, is that women have the capacity to be violent just like men. And what situation would that, what scenarios would lead to violence, women perpetuating violence? And this is one of those scenarios. So the gang itself is also a very interesting scenario in this novel. You have this bonding that happens between these women. They believe that their unity and their connection will protect them, will insulate them from the pain and discomfort that they're going through in their lives. And that bond is very strong between the first 5 members. As the book progresses, more women are brought into the fold, and this starts causing issues for some of the members, because they don't have the same level of trust, they don't have the same level of bond with these new women as they did with each other. And so you see that kind of starts to break down the intensity of their bond that they formed at the beginning. Maddie and Legs have a very typical, I would say, relationship of teenage girls. And that is this kind of obsessive jealousy and possessiveness over each other. So I think there could be an underlying love, like sexual attraction and love that is underplayed in here. It never manifests into anything, but it's definitely part of the bond, this jealousy that Maddie has about anyone else giving Legs giving anyone else attention, and Legs not loving her the best. And so that's kind of an interesting scenario in here too, is that I think teenage girls and young women have this kind of obsessive possession feeling of each other, especially when they're very insecure themselves and they're trying to figure out their own identities, and so they can project all this importance onto one person in their lives. And that's an interesting scenario that happens between Maddie and Legs. One thing that I'm always very interested about in seeing happen in women-driven novels is the exploration of abortion as a rite of passage, or as something that women have to go through in whatever time period they happen to be in. And there is a section in here. It's very brief, but it does talk about access. It does talk about kind of back alley abortion, because obviously abortion was illegal, and women getting pregnant and what they have to do to try to deal with that in the time period that they're in the novel. One of the themes in the novel that kind of happens more towards the end is that you understand that Maddie is has become a successful woman. She's now in her later years. I don't think it's specifically said, but I would say she's definitely midlife, 50s or so. And she's looking back on the life that she had, this very brief time period from the age of 14 to 17, where she was in this gang called Foxfire. And so she very much is thinking that she overcame obstacles, and this gang was also an obstacle that she overcame, that she escaped essentially a very bad fate that could have befallen her if she would have continued down the road of Foxfire. And so that perspective is kind of interesting too, because she's looking back, but it's not a main theme of the novel. I feel like you are mostly very present in the moment, and that's the way the confessional diary style is told. So some of the members of the gang end up getting into terrible trouble and kind of disappearing, and you don't really know what happens to them. And then some of the members of the gang are wrapped up when Maggie is looking back later on as an adult. And I think there's this assumption made that the ones who were really the coolest, the ones who were the leaders, the ones who were had the most power, are the ones that ended up losing control and ended up not making it through this time period. Whereas the ones that were in the gang that were a little bit more demure, a little bit more intellectual, maybe a little bit more uncertain of the circumstances they were in, they end up making it through and end up becoming adults. So that's another interesting format that happens here. I would say that this whole novel is told very episodically in some ways. You kind of jump from situation to situation and find out what the women did, how they did it, who helped them, who deterred them. And again, that style may not be for everyone, but I think what it did for me was it showed this kind of time period and the kind of strangeness of memory, that you're trying to look back into this time period, you remember something, it relates to something else, and you don't necessarily tell the whole story all at once, but relate it in certain sections and certain times. I think for me, what's really beautiful about this novel is another example of female friendship, of female bonding, and the idea of taking back power. And so this is pre-feminism. So you think about these women, they're young women, they're trying to live their lives, they're trying to get some agency. And whether or not you agree with the methods that they use in this novel, they do find a sense of found family. I think that's also a really strong theme. So they are able to let go of the families that have failed them in a lot of ways and find love and acceptance within each other. And that's a really empowering story, and I think that's a story that inspires growth. And I think this novel really points to some interesting ideas about how women are in society, especially if you're talking about the 1950s, where we very much associate that time with these manicured lawns and beautifully adorned housewives who are living in the suburbs, wearing pearls and making drinks for their husbands when they come home. You think of Bobby Sox, you think of going to have sodas and listen to music from the jukebox in the little, not, what are they called, the drugstores and the soda shops. So that is your impression of teenage life in that time. And if you think about the rougher side, so like Rebel Without a Cause or something like that, you're thinking about men, you're not thinking about women. And so this is an alternative version of that. This is think about these women who were trying to break free from, in a lot of cases, really abusive and unsatisfactory home lives. And the things that they had to do that, and the empowerment that they found within each other. And there's also a period in here where one of the characters is incarcerated, and so you get to hear about that experience and how that affected this character mentally and physically. And so again, there's just this side of being a woman that I don't think is really talked about in this way before. So please check this out if you are interested in seeing a different perspective of women's lives, thinking about how women as a group can use violence and have and probably will again use violence to find empowerment when they just don't know how to find it any other way. And as a historical record, as a way of thinking about found family and the strong bonds that women can make when they are not in competition but are actually together and trying to move forward together and empower each other. So that was Foxfire, Confessions of a Girl Gang by Joyce Carol Oates. I will be back again soon with another video. If you've read this book, please leave some comments below and let me know what you thought of it. Thank you so much for watching.